have to say, I could not be more thrilled to have this powerhouse of talent here to talk about DeFi. And I want to start off by saying there are a lot of things we could talk about here in Crypto Bahamas, and this is a session dedicated to DeFi. I'm passionate about DeFi because I'm really passionate about financial inclusion, and I think that DeFi is the best, possibly the only method we're going to have for creating a more inclusive financial system. But I'd love to hear from our panel, like you've all made leaps, you've dedicated your careers at this point to DeFi. Why is that? Why are you so passionate about it? MC, let's start with you.
Sure. So I agree with you. I think that DeFi has the potential to transform the financial system, but also it's a core foundational building block for everything we've been talking about today. So Katie Han talked about the importance of the growth of non-financial applications in crypto. You just heard a lot about NFTs and gaming. And the ability to exchange that value is critical to being able to represent it or have it actually be useful. So the explosion in play-to-earn games, the explosion in a lot of different digital property is in part, it's undergirded by DeFi. So after a decade or more in traditional finance, I was just captivated by the potential. And we're still in really early days. The entire market is 4 million users. And so there's a lot that lies ahead in terms of simplifying the user experience, and I think we'll see dramatic adoption in the next year or two.
And I think it's fascinating to see there are a plethora of conferences exploding in subcultures within crypto, right? There's NFT conferences, play-to-earn conferences, but every conference has a session on DeFi, and there's a reason for that, which is it's the backbone, the foundation of this entire ecosystem. But Rebecca, I'd love to hear what drew you to this.
Similar to MC, I think, and similar to you, I think that both DeFi and the Web3 infrastructure is really meant to transform the way we interact with each other and the way we interact with the world around us. And so it will transform the way we deal with finance. It will transform the way we communicate with each other through decentralized social media, which has gotten a lot of attention today and in the past week or two. And I think it will also transform the way we deal with culture generally through NFTs and the arts and how we're digitizing music and art in general. So I'm excited by what we can see from this evolution and how we can build out something new and continue innovating in the whole system generally.
And Liz?
Yeah, I think we've all come from traditional finance backgrounds, and I think it was quite glaringly obvious over the last few decades how inaccessible and cost prohibitive traditional capital markets is. That's only gotten worse, and it's a radical departure in how Aave and Uniswap thinks about the essential manufacture and distribution of financial engineering. So that, to me, is absolutely disruptive in a way that incremental innovation can't quite improve on capital market structures today. So I find that extremely profound.
So given that we're poised for a radical transformation via DeFi and DeFi applications of the entire financial system, what are the barriers and challenges? Like, why aren't we there yet? Why isn't this catching on like wildfire all around the world? Maybe, Rebecca, I'll start with you.
Sure. So I think there are a number of different pieces that are making DeFi adoption challenging, or there are some barriers to entry. Some of it is just knowledge. I think MC can talk to the making the user experience better. I think there are a lot of people working on that right now in a number of different ways in terms of making it really accessible. And I think that the other piece of it is there is uncertainty around the regulatory structure as it relates to DeFi, right? We all know the way we interact with financial intermediaries. We have certainty around the financial system as it exists today through regulation that focuses on financial intermediaries, but when you remove those intermediaries, I think there is both uncertainty from users or consumers as well as from regulators as to how to deal with this new system. I think the positive part of that is that those of us in the DeFi space are really focused on removing that barrier to entry as soon as humanly possible. So both myself and a number of others, including the Council, the Crypto Council for Innovation, as well, and the DeFi Education Fund and the Blockchain Association, and a number of others behind the scenes are really working to speak to and educate regulators in the US, in the EU, and in the UK to ensure that there is, one, a really important and detailed understanding of how the technology works, and two, where we can create evergreen regulation that will give the same level of certainty to users while also making sure we don't stifle innovation. So I think those are the two big pieces, I think, on barriers to entry.
MC?
Yeah, I would agree that user experience is a huge barrier, but I also think that we haven't explained the concrete benefits. So a lot of what we just said probably sounds very abstract, in sort of financial inclusion, more transparency, better market structure, but we, I think, have to do a better job of explaining what that actually means. So for example, if you have a decentralized exchange, anyone in the world can become a liquidity provider. That's a revolutionary concept that I find sometimes has to be repeated over and over for it to sink in terms of what that means. Why is that positive? Why is taking what today has huge barriers to entry, massive technology investment, huge costs in traditional markets to be a liquidity provider and letting anyone do that? It transforms that and makes it an investment strategy for anybody. So you have to sort of walk through some of those benefits. I think we have to make that clear. And then the user experience, absolutely. So just to break it down, I mean, if you want to use Aave or Uniswap, you have to first swap, obviously, exchange through a fiat on-ramp your fiat into on a centralized exchange. Then you have to get a wallet like MetaMask or LizWorks and use a non-custodial wallet, and then you have to connect your wallet. So those hiccups in today's world of seamless technology are really meaningful, and at every point, it's an opportunity for someone who's already nervous to stop and decide that they don't want to participate. But I do think in the matter of certainly 12 months, if not less, we'll see those be compressed. And you'll see that you can, with 1 click or 2 clicks, you can start to join a DAO. You can start to participate as a liquidity provider somewhere. So I'm really optimistic that that part is being very actively worked on by many, many companies, including Uniswap Labs.
Liz?
Yeah, I'm actually quite optimistic because, yes, we've seen sort of rapid adoption of DeFi among retail participants in the last 2 years. Early last year, we had several funds approach us to say, I'm using a spreadsheet, a ledger device, and the Orange Fox to manage my portfolio, and I need something better. And that really was the origins of why we launched MetaMask Institutional, with primarily 3 basic fundamental user needs being solved. One was custodial access to DeFi, which had then the multi-user permissioning that professionals needed to run an industrial portfolio management solution for DeFi. The second was, how do you think about counterparty risk in context of DeFi? It is quite, it's very different to any kind of marketplace in TradFi. And so, that's also a technologically solvable problem. And we did solve that by indexing addresses tagged for various nefarious activities and being able to surface a risk score that gave you an idea of the health of the pool that you're about to interact with. And then thirdly, just improving, you touched upon the user experience, basic tools like how do I look at my portfolio? How do I understand how have I performed?
How do I calculate my taxes?
And my taxes. And we've solved that with a dashboard. And it's really interesting. We talk about the portfolio trilemma, the portfolio view trilemma of how do we have a solution that is low latency, scalable, but is still getting data from a hugely fragmented market. And that's a challenge that we've been busy building towards solving for. We launched in October, and we've had 150 organizations join the platform and exponentially growing. So we've solved a few of the building blocks that was required to actually look at DeFi from a professional, institutional standpoint. But there's just, there are many more challenges,
Yeah, I think also just to build on both of your points, I mean, DeFi is so young, right? Yeah. DeFi summer was like 2 summers ago, maybe 3 summers ago. I don't even remember. 2 summers ago. I was in it. I just don't remember.
2020.
But DeFi is a very young. Like in some ways, we can say we're still in an R&D phase, and this is the most exciting R&D phase I've ever seen. Right? You have an influx of people. People on Wall Street are leaving their but even others are also leaving their long-time jobs in traditional finance to come build this new system in general. So, when you're talking about are there barriers? Yes, but there are so many users today, even in just this short period of time, and people are really dedicating themselves to building out this system. So while they're, and as I said, and then making sure the system is accessible in a safe and environment. And so I think that there is a lot of promise, as Liz said.
Yeah, well, at the Crypto Council, we of course focus on regulation, and the innovations you're describing, Liz, are exactly the kinds of things that I think a lot of agencies, especially in the United States, want to see. How do you get more information at the right time, do more education, provide a holistic overview of what these assets are doing, when to engage, how to engage, and engage in consumer education, which I think is a big part of what is causing a little bit of stress among some regulatory agencies. So a lot of people do say that regulation is the big risk here, that if the wrong regulation gets put into place, this whole thing is going to constrict. It's going to constrict the growth of DeFi. And I'm really curious to get your thoughts on that. And what specifically, if that is true, if you agree with that, then what specifically do you think the real risks and challenges are when it comes to the regulatory environment and landscape? Maybe MC, you're nodding.
Yeah, sure. So any financial system or financial services come with risks, and I think it's actually an opportunity to have better compliance solutions because you have an instantly transparent, immutable record, obviously, right? So whether that means better disclosure, whether that means ways to attack market manipulation, to have better anti-money laundering, to think creatively about what about KYC rules is effective and actually solving for a problem, and what is just implementing a series of existing regulations. So I think this is an opportunity to have rules that protect consumers even more. And so we work proactively, particularly in the US with the Biden administration, with different agencies to help them think about what that could look like. But you're right that today the sort of confusion about, well, what rules pertain and which ones don't, does, I think, sometimes linger in people's minds. Sam mentioned this morning that there really aren't, it's not clear that there's direct analogs for some of the things in DeFi, right? So there's analogs for some things like market surveillance, but there may not be direct analogs for like asset creation. DeFi's enabled user-generated markets for the first time. And so in the same way that YouTube and user-generated content exploded copyright regimes and exploded the regulatory framework for intellectual property and content, I do think that that's going to happen and is happening in financial services. That doesn't mean that we can't try to kind of shoehorn in the meantime, but I think that the ability for anyone in the world to create a market for anything does mean that we're going to ultimately have to have a different approach.
I mean, I think that's right. But let's back up for a second and say the way that DeFi works today already addresses a lot of the things that our traditional financial regulations are intended to address. So counterparty risk, yes, I think looking at a pool as a whole is important, but you don't have peer-to-peer counterparty risk in the same way when you're interacting with a DeFi pool. It also has enhanced transparency. You can watch the entire system in real time. It's actually something when I'm speaking to policymakers and regulators that I actually try to emphasize a lot, to say, like, you're not going to have to do an 18-month audit and fly a whole team to Texas to look at a small bank. Like, you can watch it all happen as it goes. It also, I think, eliminates the information asymmetries that the securities laws were created to address. So as an initial matter, we need to start with a different baseline, which is a lot of the things that old regulations or traditional financial regulations were intended to address have already been addressed. So then the next question is, what are the goals underlying other regulation and how do we implement those? Like consumer protection, or a lot of is who is liable at the end of the day is going to look different because there are different actors in the space. It's not the same as the traditional intermediaries that we're used to. But I will say I'm optimistic about this too, because I do believe that while there was this rush to talk about regulation and to try to say and implement things that look like regulation, I have seen a slowing down, particularly in the United States, and I think in particular with the executive order, to say, let's learn about the technology, let's figure it out. We understand, especially with respect to DeFi, that we're not quite sure what this is, and we do need a little education around it. And I can say, I'm sure you've had the same experience as well, and I know your GR team at ConsenSys too, but everybody is engaging, I'd say on a weekly basis, with various policymakers and regulators to do these DeFi 101s. Now I've created a advanced topics in DeFi presentation, so we're getting somewhere. DAOs are part of that. So I think that there has been a slowing down, which gives me hope that there will be this regulation that works in decentralized systems. But even to go back to some of the earlier panels, I think on the layer 1 panel, they were talking about what decentralization means. That's a core tenet that we're going to have to address as we're creating regulation, and it's very hard to give concrete contours to decentralization.
Regulation isn't all bad. I would say, it is important to establish identity on chain. And I think there are some nuances in how you go about the right framework or the right design that enforces this and gives, firstly, who takes the liability now that it's a radically different paradigm. But there are like you mentioned, it is more transparent, it's more auditable, it's more real time. These are technological challenges that can be solved. I am hugely encouraged by the work that we're doing collectively with protocols, custodians, and identity providers to come up with solutions that are scalable. Because keep in mind, you're going from a paradigm where you have maybe 24 broker-dealers that were syndicating risk to now 17,000 plus, right? And so how do we think about a scalable solution in addressing that? I don't think that, the core principles of investor protection, identity, and audit trail, being able to monitor, those things are still very relevant in this market.
Yeah, something we talk about a lot is just what are the goals behind any regulation or policy? And the goal is not regulation of an industry, it's one of these public policy goals. It's consumer protection, it's identification of illicit activity and disincentivization of that kind of activity. And what we always say is that technology itself, to your point, Rebecca, really makes a lot of that possible and must be factored into account. But that relies, of course, on the idea that we truly are decentralized. That's a premise, it's in the name DeFi. So I want to click on what you said. It is the hardest question, I think, for any of us to answer, and it varies across the ecosystem of DeFi. So how do we know decentralization when we see it, right? Like, what are the kind of triggers, signals, symbols of a truly decentralized system?
Two ways to think about that. One is, in the same way that Satoshi Nakamoto can't control or change the Bitcoin blockchain, a truly decentralized protocol, there's no single entity, there's no single team that can likewise single-handedly change things, whether that's technical changes, governance changes and the like. The second thing, though, I think it's more sort of practical than theoretical, is a functioning governance system. So there's different approaches to governance of decentralized protocols. Some have deliberately minimized governance because decentralized governance is complicated and can take, or not so much complicated, but can take time. But I think if you look at Aave, for example, or Compound and Uniswap, you've seen major decisions like upgrades of the smart contracts, change of rates, the addition of different fee tiers, like these fundamental decisions have ultimately been decided on by token holders. And I think those are the sort of proof points that decentralization is working. And meanwhile, the core teams that maybe had started some of those protocols are moving on to focus on user experience and that sort of application layer, while sort of the decentralization of the protocol takes shape and matures.
Yeah. I think the hallmark is control. I usually talk about it in 3 parts, but 2 of them are yours too. So one is it technologically decentralized? Are you deployed to a permissionless blockchain that's run by numerous nodes and that there is no central point, as you said, of control or failure or anything like that? Is it decentralized from a governance perspective? So do you have a number of non-coordinated, dispersed, and diffuse entities, wallets, whoever it may be, voting and making decisions on the changes? And then the last is the original software developer decentralized away from the growth of the technology? And I think that's when we're bringing regulation back into it, it's something that policymakers think a lot about because they are focused on this intermediary aspect too. Is the creator of this new system still involved in it? And I think it's really tough when you've developed something like software that you really love to pull yourself away from it. But I think because it is such a core tenet, even just from an ethos perspective, right, like of the cypherpunks originally, to be the software developer who doesn't hold an admin key and has no ability to control user funds, who is not the one pulling things behind the strings, who's not participating actively in governance or controlling governance in some behind the way scenes. And so that's the really nebulous part, right? right? The other two you can really measure. And so I think the hardest part is to measure this decentralization away of the creator, from the system and the ecosystem around it. But I'm really encouraged by that. Obviously, Uniswap is very different because you guys don't have an admin key, and it is sort of its own growth. But even for us, we don't hold an admin key. It's held by governance, and so controlled by this group of over 100,000 unique wallet addresses that vote in governance and make proposals and the like. And so I think that there's a lot of promise to governance and to moving software developers away from their original projects.
I can't add much to what both of you say, and MetaMask is not decentralized. But what I can say as a byproduct of a decentralized finance or financial markets is that we've seen the proliferation of tens of thousands of DeFi protocols emerge without a single corporate enterprise really doing anything. This was an ecosystem play. We've had protocols spring up and integrate to MetaMask, and that's basically created 30 million monthly active users on the wallet today. What has been a byproduct of this is you have now these composable Lego pieces of different financial primitives that all work together, and that's what is absolutely fascinating about DeFi as opposed to the earlier siloed forms of issuance and distribution of risk.
And so one thing I think people find confusing a lot, right? So Rebecca, you don't work for Aave, you work for the Aave companies, right? MC, you don't work for Uniswap, you work for Uniswap Labs. Can you just explain the difference there so everyone understands? Because you are employed by an entity that has that name in it, and people don't understand how that aligns with decentralization. So Rebecca, you're the lawyer, maybe I'll turn to you first.
Sure. I mean, just to go back to the last point I made about the software developer versus the protocol, I work for the Aave companies. You should think of it like Google or any other software development company, Twitter, whatever it may be. And unlike traditional software development companies, we don't control or hold or have data or information or anything like that about the users of the software we created. And then Aave, the protocol, really lives on the Ethereum blockchain and some other blockchains as well, because governance has voted to deploy it there. And it is controlled and used by a pseudonymous group of people, and I'm not employed by the DAO, and those users have nothing to do with me, and I have nothing to do with those users, but our company is continuing to build software and new and different types of innovative Web3 products, and that's the difference for me.
And maybe, MC, you can speak a bit about governance. We talked a bit about governance, but just to level set for folks, what does that mean exactly?
Right. So as Rebecca said, both Aave and Uniswap decentralized protocols. So that means that the team at Uniswap Labs was the original creator and is still a core contributor to the Uniswap protocol, but they are self-executing autonomous smart contracts on the Ethereum blockchain and now a few other blockchains. So if our team were to dissolve, Uniswap will continue to operate. The protocol itself grows. We have no proactive growth efforts, no proactive business development efforts.
There's just this really I have to say it because we're here, but there's this really famous legal opinion that was written by a district court in the Southern District of New York, where they talk about the Bahamas test, how something's decentralized, where everyone in crypto decamps and goes to the Bahamas, and the protocol keeps growing. So since we're in the Bahamas, that's an important point.
So thank you for making me feel so relevant. I could stay here forever and nothing would change. It would not make any difference whatsoever. It's true. So that's one principle, is that the technology itself is self-executing. Uniswap Labs, the team, is now building other products that you can think about that is analogous to, in the case of email, SMTP, the core protocol, and then you have Gmail, the sort of application layer. It's building products that help you access email, make it safer, simpler, et cetera. But governance, how does governance work? So there is a Uni token associated with the Uniswap protocol. There are 300,000 holders. The token, when it was created, was airdropped to all the users of the protocol up until that point, and then also to some of the original contributors of the protocol. The ownership of that has spread over time because you can buy the token in different places. And any owner of the token can put forward a proposal, or any person could ask to have Uni delegated to them to put forward a proposal. So a couple examples. There was a proposal put forward by a member of the community to create a 1 basis point fee tier on stablecoin pairs. And they put forward that proposal. It was voted on. There's sort of 3 phases of the voting process. You require a quorum of about 4% of the total outstanding tokens, which is very low in the context of corporate governance. So the barriers to participation are really very, very low to pass a proposal. And that passed. And that proposal then increased the Uniswap protocol's market share in stablecoin trading from about 40% to like 85% of stablecoin trading. So the owners of the owners of the token, the participants in the protocol, are incentivized to think about what will drive its growth and to make it resilient. And one other example I'll just share: people constantly will ask or tweet, when is Uniswap going to be deployed on other chains? That's another decision that is governed by the DAO, the Decentralized Autonomous Organization, by the decentralized governance. So there have already been 3 proposals to deploy on other chains. The code to deploy on other chains is open source, publicly available on GitHub. And so hopefully that gives you a sense as to the kinds of things that require the decentralized governance participation.
Thanks for that. So Liz, you and we're adjacent but very engaged with the DeFi ecosystem, right? So I'm on the steering committee of DeFi Education Fund, the Orange Box, of course. What are you most excited about and watching most closely in the DeFi space?
I'm really enthusiastic about the rapid institutional adoption in DeFi. I personally speak to 20 funds a week at this point, talking about the institutional measures that you can put in place to industrialize participation in this asset class. I'm hugely optimistic about that continuing to grow. We have 7 custodians on our platform today, and we're going to continue to be agnostic and aggregate across various solutions to create a really the tools that you need to really manage this asset class. So I'm terribly optimistic, even though I work in a DAO. I mean, to give you an example, like Gnosis, for example, custodies $100 billion in assets, primarily DAO treasuries, right? They're not a custodian, but that's what you have, and then you get to answer questions, fundamental questions of really what is custody when the asset is on the blockchain? What is private key management? Do you need a qualified custodian? What's the right way to keep your assets safe? How do you think about security? Those are the kind of questions that I spend most of my time thinking about, and there's strong market interest to come up with solutions that address that.
I just want to pause there from it. 20 funds a week. The DeFi summer was 2020, I remember, because it was right after the lockdowns and everything else that's seared in my brain. That's in 2 years, not even 2 years, we're seeing massive entrance of institutional investors into this space. It basically complements the massive explosion in retail that we're seeing as well. And so this is happening so fast. It's just happening every single day. We're just seeing doubling, tripling explosions in the amount of value held within the DeFi ecosystem, in strides in the user interface that we talked about earlier, which I think are critical to increasing adoption, and also more and more understanding on the part of those who are in positions of power, policymakers, regulators, others, that can affect the trajectory of this ecosystem and push it, I would say, towards a more inclusive model. So I'd love to just conclude quickly with just, if there's one thing you'd love the audience to take away about DeFi, what is it? Let's go down the line. MC, we'll start with you.
I'd say it's that DeFi is a core enabler of the entire growth of crypto.
Nicely put.
I feel like we're done.
Mic drop, exactly.
I feel like we should end with that. But to that point, I think, and to points we talked about earlier, this is the most exciting time, right? We are extremely early in DeFi, and where we are going to go from here, I don't think any of us can really imagine, given the innovation that's occurred in the last 2 years. And so I am incredibly excited to see what DeFi brings to all of us in the coming years.
How do I top that, right? No, I'm extremely excited about the access it brings. The universe of funds has gone from maybe 100 funds that banks were willing to serve profitably to now tens of thousands, right? So I think that access and democratization of capital markets is what I find so fascinating about DeFi.
Yeah, and I'll echo that and just say for me, the answer is just as we see this connection between more regulatory clarity that will enter this space and going from 10 different things you have to do, to like 1 click, 2 click, and you're in, I think we're going to see the promise really realized of having a more democratic, inclusive, equitable, and accessible financial system, which is certainly the reason I think a lot of us entered this space, recognizing problems that exist in TradFi that we don't want to port over into this new system. So thank you so much to our incredible panel today, to all of you for coming. Enjoy the rest of your conference.
Thank you.